up, Sauce Gang, and welcome back to the channel. Hot Sauce Beats here with another oversimplified reaction. Last week we checked out the Cold War Part 1, and holy cow, I did not realize how much stuff there was behind the Cold War and the fact that it almost turned into World War III very quickly. But today we're peeping out part 2 to that, and I'm beyond hyped to get our learn on, because even as a Navy veteran, there's still so much of this stuff that I have no clue on, because a lot of this was way before my time. So I am beyond hyped to learn today. But before we do, make sure you show OverSimplified some love by subscribing to their channel, and if you enjoy my reaction, smash that subscribe button because it greatly helps. But enough talking, let's get to reacting and roll that bomb ass intro.
Hot Sauce Beats is finally here. Hot Sauce Beats is finally here. Eat, sleep, make beats. Eat, sleep, make beats.
Hot Sauce Beats. Woo woo. Oh, let's go, Sauce Gang. Let's get our learn on.
For anyone who thinks recent U.S. history has never been as crazy as it is right now, allow me to present to you
Our history is always crazy, bro.
Division, major political assassination.
You can't have U.S. history and not have the word crazy in there somewhere. It's always crazy.
Nations.
Because Americans are kind of crazy, and we'll all admit that.
And the closest the world has ever come to nuclear apocalypse.
Bro.
Shocked by the CIA's intrusive methods for putting down socialism in Latin America, a certain Fidel Castro met with a certain Che Guevara in a bar in Mexico City, and the two of them decided they should grow some awesome beards and overthrow the Cuban government, which is exactly what they did. Cuba had been America's summer playground, and America didn't like seeing a communist regime being set up in its own backyard. So the US immediately began training up Cuban exiles to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro. However, as the day of the operation came closer, Kennedy wanted to conceal any US involvement in the plan, so he massively scaled back American air support, and as a result, the Bay of Pigs invasion was a humiliating defeat for America. But Castro felt there was still an impending US threat to his regime. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, Khrushchev had a lot of medium-range nuclear missiles that couldn't reach America, but they could if they were positioned, say, on an exotic Caribbean island off the coast of Florida.
So, again, I don't know much about this, but I do know pretty much every American knows about this history of time in regards to, again, this is where, like, every American was building bomb shelters in their backyard because we thought we were getting nuked by Cuba. I mean, this was a very crazy, and the fact that, I mean, we were on the brink of World War III. I mean, you know, thank God it didn't happen. I didn't realize how close we were to it. But
I'm a communist who hates America. You're a communist who hates America. You know what that means? We should fall in love. I was just gonna suggest you set your missiles up in Cuba. Oh, no, you're right. That's a better idea. Be still, my beating heart. On October 14th, 1962, a U-2 spy plane over Cuba noticed something strange. Sir, you need to look at this photograph. You're right. That's the cutest dog I've ever seen. Sir, I was referring more to the Soviet missiles. America freaked out as they realized what was going on. They were completely vulnerable, and they had to act fast.
God,
they knew that airstrikes.
If you're in Washington, you're a happy camper.
Nuclear war with the Soviet Union. So Kennedy came up with another idea: a blockade. The U.S. Navy announced it would stop and search any Soviet ships heading to Cuba, and would sink any that did not comply. In response, the Soviet put its military into full combat readiness. The U.S. did the same and began drawing up plans for an attack on Cuba. Things were escalating fast, and both superpowers were getting ready for World War III. Emergency communications between the two sides broke down as Khrushchev rejected Kennedy's demands for the missiles to be removed. And for the first time in history, U.S. Strategic Air Command moved to DEFCON 2. DEFCON 1 means nuclear war. The Soviets shot down a U-2 spy plane over Cuba. A Soviet nuclear submarine in the Caribbean mistakenly believed war had already broken out, and two of the senior officers gave the go-ahead to fire its nuclear torpedo. Thankfully, the third senior officer, this beautiful man, refused to authorize the decision. The U.S. finalized its preparations, and I kid you not, the day before the U.S. were set to decide the day and time for the Cuban invasion, Khrushchev was like, hey, you know if you just removed your missiles from Turkey, we'd remove ours from Cuba? Yeah, that sounds good to me.
Dude, what? Oh my God, that is mind-blowing, dude. Probably like 12 hours away from essentially the start of World War III. 12 hours, dude. Wow. Like, mind blown.
A bit more complicated than that, but at the last second, the two sides finally came to an agreement. Soviet missiles were shipped out of Cuba, and the world breathed one gigantic sigh of relief, except for one guy, who was bloody livid. Phew, let's hope that's the biggest crisis of my presidency. Unfortunately for him, his presidency was to end with one. Having nearly blown up the planet, a few changes were made. First, the superpowers agreed to a limited test ban treaty. Secondly, the Soviets ousted Khrushchev and replaced him with Leonid Brezhnev, who was a kisser. He
I
liked
think I remember.
to kiss. Both sides were deeply concerned at the prospect of nuclear war, but still, the arms race raged on throughout the 60s and 70s. US intelligence worked out that the Soviets' nuclear arsenal was not as powerful as they previously thought, but in fact, it was America that held the advantage. ABMs and MIRVs were developed, and the doctrine of MAD. If both sides knew they'd be completely destroyed by a nuclear war, neither would risk starting one. But even without war, the world was already feeling the effects of nuclear.
And I don't even know, dude, if they're gonna talk into this, but I mean, the game changers when they developed submarines that carried nuclear missiles, dude. And something like, I don't know, one sub carries enough to, which I was on submarines, by the way, but I think they say something like to kill the world 3 times over, something like that. I mean, why? How is one destroyed Earth not enough? I mean, that sounds like something like some supervillain would say. We must destroy the world 3 times. If you get it, you get it.
Nuclear weapons. In 1966, above the pleasant town of Palomares in Spain, a US bomber collided with a tanker mid-air, and 4 hydrogen bombs fell and landed near the town below. It hasn't exploded, so I'm sure everything's fine. Whoa, boy. Hey, I wouldn't eat that if I were you. Okay. What were you gonna do today? Go for a swim? Yeah, I wouldn't. Are you breathing right now? Yeah? Yeah.
I wouldn't.
I wouldn't.
Hold
It
your
took the
breath.
Americans 2.5 months to find one of the bombs, which had gone missing in the ocean. This was the 14th time America had lost a nuclear bomb since 1950.
Broken Arrow. There's a movie called Broken Arrow with John Travolta, and I forgot that's what that term means. 13 instances?
50. Nobody knows how many bombs the Soviet Union lost. So sleep well tonight. After Kennedy's assassination, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson took over, and he inherited a developing crisis in the East, Vietnam. Back in the 50s, the
my
Vietnamese
goodness,
had
bro.
kicked their French colonizers out once and for all, and the country was divided into 2. In the north, a communist regime, and in the south, an anti-communist regime. Both were led by very sweet-looking old men, but don't let that deceive you. They were both ruthless dictators, and both dreamed of reuniting Vietnam under their own regime. So the north established the National Liberation Front, also known as the Viet Cong, to carry out a campaign of guerrilla warfare in the south with Soviet support. The US sent advisors to help train the South Vietnamese to deal with the threat, but President Diem's brutal policies pushed more and more South Vietnamese
Dude,
to
again,
support the
it's
Viet
just-
Cong.
no one
And
ever
over the
wins
next
in war.
decade,
Everyone
the situation
loses.
escalated to a breaking point. America feared the domino effect. That is, if South Vietnam fell to communism, would Cambodia be next? Then Laos? Thailand? Burma? India? LBJ had to make a choice between losing South Vietnam or sending in the troops, and so in they went. From 1965, America found itself in a war unlike anything it had ever fought before.
Well, yeah, because this is where like guerrilla warfare really introduced itself to us in regards to, I mean, we couldn't have won in Vietnam. I don't even really know if we should have been there. However, I understand they were worried if that whole area would have fell, like what would have happened, you know, to like the whole world. But I mean, it's hard to, you know, go into a foreign territory that there's tunnel. I mean, they said there was something like thousands of miles of tunnels dug all around there that you can't win. And I mean, we lost a lot of people there. A lot of people. It was bad. It was, and I mean, they said it. OverSimplified said it earlier. I mean, it was embarrassing.
4. Let's play Spot the Viet Cong Soldier.
Yeah, see,
Did you see him?
can't see him.
Of course not. That's because millions of young American men were drafted and sent to fight a ruthless enemy who used the thick jungle as its shield. It was nearly impossible to tell where the enemy was, or worse, who it was. And as a result, the civilian population got caught up in the brutal crossfire. The city of Saigon found itself under regular attack, and America launched a bombing campaign in the north during Operation Rolling Thunder. The Viet Cong used the Ho Chi Minh Trail running through Laos and Cambodia to supply the campaign. It was a long and brutal war, and I could never do it justice in this video. But in terms of the Cold War, Vietnam was probably the biggest of many, many global
he ever cover
conflicts
Vietnam?
that signaled a turning point. Under the threat of nuclear war, the two superpowers began working to make their relationship more constructive, and as a result, their ideological battle shifted away from the potential of direct conflict and more towards attempting to influence smaller proxy wars around the world. In the Middle East, the Soviet Union provided aid against Israel during the Six-Day War, and then again when the US backed Israel during the Yom Kippur War. In Africa, the Angolan Civil War saw US-supported South Africans fighting Soviet-supported.
And that's the thing, man. Like, when you got these superpowers, you know, like US and Russia, we always have to dabble into everything, man. Like, we just can't let things be. And I understand that, you know, all of, you know, Britain, China, Japan, you know, us, Russia, and I apologize for any country I didn't mention, but we all view ourselves as these, like, ultra superpowers that we, you know, we're the world police, but sometimes you just gotta let other countries handle their stuff. You know what I mean? It's
Cuban.
crazy,
In the
dude.
conflict between Somalia and Ethiopia, the superpowers interestingly switched sides as regimes changed, and the US continued fighting the spread of communism in its own backyard, funding the famous Contra groups to fight the socialist junta in Nicaragua. These proxy wars were fierce enough to begin with, but superpower intervention amplified the destruction and created alarming levels of human suffering throughout the Third World.
Wow.
And in Vietnam, that human suffering was all being broadcast back home via good old television. Going into the late 60s,
Yeah,
America was
Americans
a
hated us being
This
at
became
war
this.
in Vietnam.
This became this, and this became this. The new slogan that was taking root,
Make love, not war, bruh.
The majority of Americans did not approve of Johnson's handling of the Vietnam War, and in 1968, a silent majority elected law and order candidate Richard Nixon. As the Vietnam War appeared
I
to be
am not a
increasingly
crook.
unwinnable, and
I
public
am not a
opinion became
crook.
increasingly sour, Nixon made the decision to begin bringing the troops home and ended U.S. involvement in Vietnam by 1973. 2 years later, the South fell. The Cold War was now taking its toll on both superpowers. In Russia, a huge percentage of the budget was still going to the military. People were still hungry, and they just didn't have access to the same lifestyle and goods as the West. And what did they have to show for it? They weren't even winning the space race anymore. Both sides needed to reduce spending.
Darn it,
in order
we're
to
not even
rescue
on the
their
moon
economies.
anymore!
And so both welcomed with open arms an easing of hostilities, otherwise known as Detente. To improve relations, Nixon became the first U.S. president to visit Moscow in 1972, and Brezhnev returned the gesture a year later. A number of treaties were signed, including the 1972 SALT agreement that limited nuclear weapons. Relations with China were even improving via ping-pong diplomacy when the U.S. table tennis team went on a tour of the People's Republic. However, internally, China was still pushing anti-capitalist propaganda, which led to some mixed messages. Nixon even
love
visited
you,
China
American
in
pigs.
1972, and it was a barrel of laughs.
Today, the president walks among priceless treasures from China's golden age. Among them, a pair of ear stoppers used by the emperor to keep from hearing criticism.
You put the stopper into his ears so that he couldn't hear the criticism.
Give me a pair of
Give me a pair of Bruh. Doo-doo.
Everything was going great for Nixon, until it was uncovered that back home he was being a very naughty boy and violating constitutional protocol. I'm announcing today my resignation as president, and I'm passing the office to my vice president.
Yeah, I was just about to say Gerald Ford. I knew this because Gerald Ford's from Omaha, Nebraska. Nebraska. That's where I live. Good old state of Nebraska. The good life. That's our quote. I'll stop talking.
Gerald Ford. Wow, you mean in America that people can actually remove their leader when he breaks the law? Why not just rule by force? Where's the corruption? And my first act as president is to pardon Nixon. Ah, there it is. After the whole fiasco, Americans decided what they really wanted was just a nice, safe guy who wouldn't cheat on them. So they elected Jimmy Carter, and the two sides met in Vienna where they signed yet another strategic arms limitation treaty. It's an honor, Premier Brezhnev. Likewise, President Carter. Please don't do that. But that's not to say there was no longer any tension between the two sides, because there was. Heaps of it. Once again, the Soviet Union put down further attempts at reform and rebellion in the Eastern Bloc. The Euro missile crisis saw new and improved classes of intermediate-range missiles being deployed in Europe. In 1979, the Soviets thought it would be a good idea if they had their own Vietnam and invaded Afghanistan to prevent a US-sponsored Islamic insurgency. And in response to these various crises, Olympic Games were boycotted. Conservatives were concerned that US policy had become too soft. And
no
in
one can be
1980, they
happy.
decided they wanted a president who would be tough on communism, so they elected Ronald Reagan. And Reagan came in guns blazing. Concerned.
Yeah, he did. He came in blazing everything, dude. Blazing everything. Ronald Reagan, and then was Daddy Bush after him, but the war on drugs. something, and I'm gonna screw this up. I know I'm gonna screw this up, but it's something like over half of our jail population, over half of the population in America in jails. I'm really messing this up. Over half of the people in jail are there from just drug convictions, and something like 80% of those are marijuana drug convictions, dude. Like,
at the Soviet Union's human rights violations, he made a speech calling them an evil empire, and he also wanted to renew the arms race using technological advances in computing and lasers. He came up with the Space Defense Initiative, also known as Star Wars, which was basically a big defensive anti-nuke shield around the country, but a lot of people thought it was a pretty dumb idea. The Soviet Union
I think that's a brilliant idea.
As the
I want to stop nukes from hitting our
They were
country.
feeling especially threatened as their relationship with their communist ally China had broken down. Relations took a big hit in 1983 when the Soviets shot down a Korean airliner that had strayed into their airspace, and it looked like the world was going right back to mid-20th century Cold War tension. But then Brezhnev got really old and died, and was replaced by this guy who was really old and died, and was replaced by this guy who was really old and died, and he was replaced by Mikhail Gorbachev. Coming into office in 1985, he was the real game changer.
I
His
remember
philosophy
Gorbachev.
differed a lot from previous
I don't remember him from, like, obviously me being, maybe I was a kid. I don't even know what year this is, but I just remember, I think he had like a pretty big spot on his head that, you know, was like pink or something. But
leaders. He felt that the reason the Soviet system and economy was struggling was that it didn't allow the Soviet people to find satisfaction in their work, because they weren't allowed to speak freely and lived in fear. Gorbachev wanted the Soviet people to be happy, but unlike previous Soviet leaders, he actually made the change happen. Within the first couple of years, he began the political movement for more openness and transparency, and the restructuring of the Soviet political and economic systems. And change very quickly took effect. People could criticize the government, they could enjoy Western pop culture, the media interviewed Margaret Thatcher, but most importantly, the Soviet people could now enjoy Pizza Hut. All hail to Gorbachev. He also knew that the arms race needed to end in order to rescue the Soviet economy, and a positive relationship with the West must be established. Constructive dialogue reopened and resulted in the INF Treaty, which saw all intermediate-range missiles eliminated, which was huge. Reagan's tone towards the Soviet Union began to soften, and things were looking up. But what would these reforms mean for the Eastern Bloc? For decades, the Soviets had been brutally suppressing any attempt at change. Now, would they be allowed? And that was the exact question on Hungary's lips when the Prime Minister visited Moscow. Gorbachev's response: he didn't necessarily agree with the reforms, but he wouldn't stop them either. He was prepared to let the Eastern Bloc choose its own future. This was massive, and the Hungarian leaders began planning free, multi-party elections. Poland followed suit, and also held elections in June. The anti-Soviet party, Solidarity, won 99 out of 100 seats in the Senate. But not just that. In Hungary, the barbed wire border between East and West was removed. The Iron Curtain was unraveling. But not all Eastern Bloc leaders were happy. Notably, East Germany was still ruled by a hardline Stalinist, Erich Honecker, and many East Germans were still eager to get out. They had been trapped by the Berlin Wall, but now they were doing the math. If they could travel to Hungary, and Hungary's border with the West was loosening, could they now make it to the West? That summer, East Germans decided Hungary was the latest top holiday destination.
Wow,
They traveled there in
everyone's
droves,
going to
and using
Hungary.
various methods, tens of thousands crossed the border into Austria and the West. Honecker was furious, and Bloc traveled to Hungary, but that civil liberties train had started rolling, and it wasn't stopping. Thousands more flocked to the West German embassy in Prague, where they stormed the fence around the embassy gardens, and a temporary refugee camp was set up. In September, deals were struck to allow the refugees to travel west via train. Back in East Germany, the people were running on a civil liberties high, and they wanted their next hit. Dissent was growing. Over time, demonstrations turned to mass protest, with plainclothes secret police officers doing their best to put down the dissent, but it had grown well out of their control. And worse, the biggest demonstration was yet to come. We're gonna put all of this down by force. Right, guys? Guys? Unfortunately, everyone had realized what he had not. This was bigger than them, and the entire East German Politburo voted him out of power. On November 4th, over 500,000 East Germans took to the streets of East Berlin. For many, there was still one big target left in their sights: that damn wall. The pressure on the East German government was too great, and on November 9th, they made a bit of a chaotic announcement that the travel ban between East and West was being lifted. The change wasn't meant to take effect until the next day, and crossing guards still had orders to shoot on sight any who tried to cross. But that night, huge crowds gathered at the crossing points, and the guards were overwhelmed. In an astronomically historic moment, after decades of family separation and travel restriction, the people were allowed to pass through. East and West Berlin.
Dude, I wasn't sure where this was going. I thought they were gonna like say yeah, and they started mowing them down. I'm like, oh my god.
Berliners couldn't believe it and celebrated together throughout the night. Some even climbed the wall and began to topple it. The Iron Curtain had fallen, and a year later, Germany would be reunited. Elections in Bulgaria, a peaceful revolution in Czechoslovakia, and a violent one in Romania brought to an end communist authority in the Eastern Bloc. America decided it would be best if it just stayed away and let the change happen, as the anti-communist movement continued all the way back to Moscow. Gorbachev had given the people the freedom to demonstrate. Now, they demonstrated for an end to the communist single-party rule, and Gorbachev had to give in. For the first time in history, elections were held in which candidates not officially endorsed by the party were allowed to run. Ambitious rival of Gorbachev, Boris Yeltsin, led a growing democratic movement. Now things here get quite confusing, and the dissolution of the Soviet Union is a complicated topic, so believe me, this is oversimplified, but it went a little bit like this. The Soviet Union was made up of a number of smaller Soviet republics, the largest of which was Russia. Yeltsin got himself elected the president of Russia, and began a struggle for sovereignty against Gorbachev and the greater Soviet Union. Communist hardliners were horrified at what Gorbachev was allowing, so they briefly kidnapped him and tried to set up their own emergency government. But Yeltsin and his supporters all gathered around the White House in Moscow and were like, no, we have a tank. So the hardliners had to concede and release Gorbachev. Wow, thanks Boris. That was a close one. No problem. And thanks to you for all the great freedom you've given us. Anytime, pal. And just to inform you, I've used that freedom you've given us to go behind your back and make a deal with Ukraine and Belarus to dissolve the Soviet Union and set up the Russian Federation. In other words, you're no longer in charge. I am. Dude. So uncool. And so decades of tension and the everlasting threat of nuclear war finally came to an end as democratic governments were established in many of the old Soviet republics. Wow. And the world got along together forever after. Right, guys?
World War III
this modern art thing is growing on me. Where can I learn to do that?
All right, chat, let's go. Let me bring you in. Now, what I do gotta say, you guys, and by you guys, I mean a lot of you guys have been recommending the Iraq 2, was it Fallen World War II? Who is this? The Fallen of World War II by Neil Halloran. So, I don't know. Maybe this weekend. But anyway, so I wanted to wait until after I got done with the Cold War series to jump into this. I don't want to wait until next Wednesday to react to the Fallen of the World War, because I feel like I kind of want to group all this together, because the next thing that I'm gonna do from OverSimplified is do the Russian Revolution, and then I think we'll kind of just go back in order of him uploading videos, you know what I mean? Because I don't really want to like jump around, but since we got into the world wars and stuff like that, I kind of wanted to group it all together, so it made sense. But more of the stories, this was terrifying, absolutely terrifying. The Cold War was scary, terrifying. World War III almost happened. Obviously, thank God it didn't. I mean, you know, I can't even fathom. I mean, what was it? 80 million people died in World War II, and that was with 2 hydrogen bombs going off. I mean, imagine multiple countries shooting nuclear bombs. I mean, a lot. I mean, we could have lost most of the population in the whole world. I mean, thank God it happened. But chat, I'm absolutely loving diving deep into OverSimplified and finding out more about the history that I know I should know, that you should know, that we all should know. But just a lot of this stuff isn't necessarily covered once you get out of elementary schools, unless if you're getting a degree in it. But so long story short, I want to get into more of this history stuff. So just like the Fallen of World War II. So let me know in the comments, what are some other videos you want me to check out in regards to history, wars? I want to learn. Let's get our learning hats on, fam. But I hope you enjoyed this. Make sure you show OverSimplified some love by subscribing to the channel. If you enjoyed my reaction, please help support the channel by smashing that subscribe and like button. It's absolutely free, and it greatly helps out the channel. Enjoy the rest of your night, and remember, it's eat, sleep, and make beats, and as usual, be kind to one another. And that's all I got. Boom, I'm out. Got a bit of love for the Sauce Gang, the Sauce Gang.